Mark and John appear to be giving different times of crucifixion for Jesus. How is that not a contradiction? Right, so this is a really good question. First, I think it's important to define what we mean when we use the word contradiction, because a lot of people, even very smart people, use this word incorrectly. So first, a contradiction is something that implies both the truth and falsity of something. So in other words, it breaks the rule of logic called the law of non-contradiction. So the law of non-contradiction states that A cannot be non-A at the exact same time. So in other words, I can't be a married bachelor. Those two words mean, the meanings of those words are mutually exclusive. So when we're looking at examples in the Bible that are often labeled as contradictions, we need to make sure that they are indeed contradictions and not just differentiations in detail or polarity in particulars. Gotta love those alliterations. Differentiations in detail, polarity in particulars. So the person asking this question is right in one sense. The Synoptic Gospels, that's the word we use to describe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, specifically, all agree that on the time when Jesus died. But John is different in, at least at face value. So according to Mark 15, Jesus died at the 3rd hour, which would be approximately 9 a.m., and then darkness covered the land at the 6th hour, which computes to 12 p.m., and then Jesus died on the 9th hour, or 3 p.m. But John 19:14 says that Jesus was still before Pilate at the 6th hour. So how do we square those facts? So there are two explanations for this. The first is that the Synoptic Gospels are using the Jewish system of timekeeping, where the day starts at 6 a.m., and John is using the Roman system of timekeeping, where the day starts at 12 a.m. And that if you compensate for that, they match up. And I'm sympathetic to this explanation, and I think it accounts for a number of details, although I know some who raise questions as to how it fits in with the chronology of the Synoptics as a whole in general. There's a scholar, though, named Craig Blomberg, and in his work, The Historical Reliability of the Gospels, he proposes that this type of critique is actually imposing a modern precise timekeeping assumption onto an ancient culture, and that both Mark and John are estimating and speaking of time in quarters. And that when we take into account the ancient understanding of time, both would be understood in their culture to be claiming a rough estimate of about midday. And I think this is totally reasonable. I mean, we have an incredible ability to measure time, and we have accessibility to those things. Right now, I have two computers, and then I have an iPhone, and then I have my watch here. But that's a modern luxury. So in ancient cultures, there wasn't necessarily the concerned. They weren't concerned with that kind of timing thing. So a number of scholars have pointed out that the 6th hour, when the Bible describes the 6th hour, you really have about a 3-hour window of that event possibly taking place. And a better description of that time of day is like the equivalent of us saying morning, afternoon, and evening. And this has to be pointed to when we see in the Gospels and Acts how it uses descriptions like the 3rd or the 6th or the 9th hour to describe stuff. And this is what Blomberg, who I mentioned before, says when he points out that Mark's 3rd hour could realistically mean anywhere between 9 a.m. and noon. And John's use of the 6th hour in the mind of the ancient reader could have been understood as something before midday. And I think this also makes sense. I mean, I've used both the disparity between Jewish timekeeping and Roman timekeeping, along with the pointing out that exact times are a modern thing. I've used both of those as explanations in the past, and I think either are entirely plausible and totally reasonable. So here's the wrap up to that particular question. A, this is not a contradiction. Mark is not saying things like, the crucifixion took place at 9 a.m. and then John is saying it did not happen at 9 a.m. That would be an outright contradiction. Instead, we need to make sure we're not anachronistically reading our modern understanding of things like time into the ancient document. So when we understand that the Synoptic Gospels and John had a particular audience, Mark, for example, having a Jewish audience, and so he uses Jewish understandings of time, and John having a more Gentile audience, and so therefore uses the more Gentile timekeeping practice. I think that makes sense. Or if we compare it to other classical literature and see that impreciseness of time measurement was the norm, and that what we see could easily be seen as Mark rounding down to the third hour and John rounding up to the sixth hour, then we start to read the Gospels in the way that they were meant to be understood. So the question is about Mark and John appearing to be giving different times. And at face value, it does appear that way. But when we start to dig into the plausible explanations as to why that is, I think not only would they not be contradictions, even if there was this type of disparity, but the differentiation in detail is easily understood when we read an ancient document not through the lens of modern thinking, but through the lens of ancient understanding.